Lecture 3, Shakespeare's The Phoenix and Turtle, on difficulty, the meaning and structure of difference.
Ladies and gentlemen, the poem called Phoenix and Turtle and attributed to Shakespeare was first published in 1601, among other poems, in an appendix to a volume by one Robert Chester called Love's Martyr. The appendix in which the poem is to be found is called in part, quote, "Diverse Poetical Essays done by the best and chiefest of our modern writers, with their names subscribed to their particular works, never before extant." Because Shakespeare was a popular modern writer in 1601, the attribution of the poem to Shakespeare, which occurs only in this place, may have been a device for securing the book a wider sale, and is therefore not entirely secure. There is no other poem like this poem among Shakespeare's works, and in fact there is no other poem like this poem among all the poems of which I am aware. The persistent attribution by the tradition, and in effect by the consent of the whole world over much time, of this poem, Phoenix and Turtle, which is like no other, to the author Shakespeare, who is like no other, implies that the poem is in some substantial way an interpretation, or understood to be such, of the action which founds the value of all other such acts, the moment or exploit of first creation, which gives rise to all others, and by comparison to which, as by comparison to our social construct, the greatest poet, Shakespeare, all others are said to be, and in fact have been, measured. Poems are, as I have said, the trace of a principle, which we call by common consent poetry, and by relationship to which the poet, who is the technician capable of that relationship, becomes capable also of supplying men and women in history with the means to regulate and in some sense overcome fundamental impediments to communicative engagement with other minds in history. In general, therefore, I should like you to note this proposition. In general, therefore, poems as we receive them are not poetry. Poems as we receive them are not poetry. They are speech of one kind, the kind persons use and understand about that speech of another kind, which enables or repairs the power of natural language. The life of the poem depends upon the fundamental difference between the actual poem at any given moment of the making of poetry in history and the principle on the life of which the actual poem depends. As a virtuous man is not virtue itself, so the poem is not poetry, nor is any actual state of affairs identical with the principle or paradigm of which it gives evidence. The poem called The Phoenix and the Turtle is an essay or experiment towards some answer to the question why poems are not and cannot be poetry. Why, in effect, persons in history cannot participate directly in the principle of all relationship. Why, therefore, marriage is not ever really consummated. Why the highest hypothesis of desire is never in the interest of the maintenance of such an hypothesis made actual in the real world. This poem is, like all our poems, post-catastrophic. And it's most markedly so. There has been an explosion or an implosion. And what we are in the presence of is a world that has been devastated by an enormous destruction. This poem, therefore, is the trace, the ash, as it were, of an event of another kind, and gives an account which constitutes an explanation why we must dwell in a world in which representation, poems, rather than the essential action they represent, is our destiny. By enacting as representation the highest hypothesis of communicative relationship, which is not in itself representable, the phoenix and the turtle presents the highest hypothesis of communicative relationship and the rationality of its impossibility as any actual state of affairs. The poem called The Phoenix and the Turtle recounts, therefore, the fall into representation, and because it is attributed to Shakespeare, is intended by the tradition as an account of the commissioning of the highest poet, Shakespeare, the bird of loudest lay. The difficulty of the poem arises fundamentally because life lived in close proximity to its ideal state is abstract and at the edge of representability, and because discourse, as this poem is, at the edge of the representable, at the other edge, just this side of unrepresentability, must struggle with the crisis of the difference between that which is deeply desired but cannot be said, and that which can, alas. The poem is a lamentation, be said, where saying consists of the discipline of desire by the rationality which has discovered its limits, the limits of desire in a secular world. What is the infinitely desirable state of affairs, the loss of which, constituting the necessity of the poem as a form of representational compromise, legitimates poetic practice? The infinitely desirable state of affairs is the capacity to narrate as one true story about the self. True in the sense that a story about an actual state of affairs is true. To narrate as one true story the two different stories, both of which are always true about actual persons, but absolutely incompatible one with the other. The story about the phoenix, the story about the self which can have no relationships, for the phoenix is reborn without relationship, cycle after cycle, on the sole Arabian tree, and is the very mark, sign, and expression of the life of the self, always acknowledgeable as part of the life of the self, which is untouchable, unreachable by others, and which must remain so. The story about the phoenix, the self which can have no relationships, and the story about the turtle dove, which is the story about the self actual only in relationship to others of its own kind. Not only are the phoenix and the turtle dove elements as archetypal stories of two different and uncommunicating myth systems, the phoenix is Eastern, Greek, the turtle is Western, Anglo-Saxon, but they refer to contradictory existential states of affairs and morally contradictory abstract imperatives in the self, to both of which each person is subject: chastity and generativity, freedom and constancy, the unconquerable solitude of the individual, the phoenix soul of every one of us, and the equally inevitable dependence of each mind on social relationship. Above all, beauty, the phoenix element, and truth, the turtle element. The phoenix and the turtle, as conjoined in the title of the poem, is the myth of which there can be no story. It is a miscegenation, do you understand, of powers. so radical that the story about these stories can never become the story of an actual state of affairs. The exhaustion of the possibility implied in the conjunction of phoenix and turtle in the title of the poem, like the exhaustion of possibility of building the everlasting London Bridge in the children's song we have studied, is the action of the poem, which is itself, as poem, the residue of the extinguishment of an action, the marriage of incompatibles of another kind. There is a principle of unity, the poem insists, one name of which is poetry, that ceases to be a benefit to men and women in history if the will to its actualization in history be not disciplined by the obligation to difference, the obligation to acknowledgement of the unreconcilability of the two stories which are true about the self. I have observed, and you have observed, that this poem, The Phoenix and the Turtle, is difficult, hard to read. One reason for its difficulty I have already laid before you. Life lived close to its ideal state is abstract, not susceptible to ordinary description. Life lived close to its ideal state is life at the edge of intelligibility. One of the purposes of this poem is to remove life by discipline of the will from proximity to its origins. And that removal is signified by reference to the practice of prayer at the end of the poem, the last line to which I will refer again and again: "For these dead birds sigh a prayer." For prayer implies the regulation of distance between the origin of life, the object of prayer, and its actuality, the praying subject. A second closely related reason for the difficulty of the poem is that the myth which must be told, the myth of which there can be no story, is fundamentally transgressive, miscegenation at the very least, and therefore subject to censorship, transgressive, or in fact treasonous, because it is the myth of no difference which is inside the will to every relationship and must not, in the interest of relationship, be actualized. Now the phoenix, note, is gendered female, and the turtle male. That's a very important genderic sorting. The phoenix is gendered female and the turtle male. The blazing image of the phoenix reborn, and you see it in your handout in that emblem which I had reproduced for you. The blazing image of the phoenix reborn figures the rebirth of the female soul as autonomous life, particularly appropriate in a state like the Elizabethan state, ruled by a queen. The myth of no difference made actual as story in the state is rebellion. If the phoenix is subject to a myth in which her story, which can have no fellow, is joined with the story of another, I warn you, you will be silenced by Elizabeth's secret police. The myth of no difference made actual as a story about language silences language and must therefore itself be silenced. But the story must be told, and this story is told as stories are told, subject to fierce censorship, as a fable. Stories subject to fierce censorship, whether in Eastern Europe prior to the current liberalization, or virtually anywhere in the social world of which I'm aware, stories subject to fierce censorship are told as a fable. Here is the poem. I shall read it to you. Before the first word of a poem, of this poem, there is a deathly silence, the absence of world. The poem is written in the line of 8 But the first position in this poem of the line of 8 is always empty. So when we begin the line, we must read the silence of a vastation. And the poem begins after that slain number, that empty position 1. The poem begins after that slain number on the count of 2. So here is the poem with that empty position registered as best I can signify it. Let the bird of loudest lay on the sole Arabian tree, herald sad and trumpet be, to whose sound chaste wings obey. But thou shrieking harbinger, foul precursor of the fiend, augur of the fever's end, to this troop come thou not near. From this session interdict every fowl of tyrant wing, save the eagle, feathered king. Keep the obsequies so strict. Let the priest in surplice white, that defunctive music can be, the death-divining swan, lest the requiem lack his right, but thou treble-dated crow, that thy sable gender makest, with the breath thou giv'st and takest, mongst our mourners thou shalt go. Here the anthem doth commence, love and constancy is dead, Phoenix and the turtle fled in a mutual flame from hence. So they loved, as love in twain had the essence but in one. Two distincts, division none, number there in love was slain. Hearts remote, yet not asunder, distance and no space was seen twixt this turtle and his queen. But in them it were a wonder. So between them love did shine, that the turtle saw his right flaming in the phoenix sight. Either was the other's mine. Property was thus appalled, that the self was not the same. Single nature's double name, neither two nor one was called. Reason, in itself confounded, saw division grow together to themselves, yet either, neither, simple were so well compounded, that it cried, how true a twain seemeth this concordant one. Love hath reason, reason none, if what parts can so remain. Whereupon it made this threne, to the phoenix and the dove, co-supremes and stars of love, as chorus to their tragic scene. Beauty, truth, and rarity, grace in all simplicity, here enclosed in cinder lie. Death is now the phoenix nest, and the turtle's loyal breast to eternity doth rest, leaving no posterity. 'Twas not their infirmity, it was married chastity. Truth may seem, but cannot be. Beauty brag, but 'tis not she. Truth and beauty buried be. To this urn let those repair that are either true or fair. For these dead birds sigh a prayer. The let with which this speaker begins this poem is the let of geometry, the human repetition of the first word of God in the Bible, which constructs as an act of the human will the axiom, the posit, lays down the rules of the ceremony or game which makes it possible to begin again. The let summons the masters of the built world, a world produced by the human will toward world which drives this poem into existence by means of a reconstructive ceremony of difference, a solemn ritual game of inclusion and exclusion. He's a member and he is not. That bird, but not this bird. A solemn ritual game of inclusion and exclusion, kindred to the children's game we have examined, but unlike the children's game in that the devastation is greater and the rules have to be taught before the anthem can be sung. The children knew the rules. In this poem, the devastation is so complete that the rules have to be taught before the singing game can be played. Let summons the powers of artifice against the desolation which is left when the real disappears and the actuality remaining is unbuilt, unfigured, unconscious of the rules of its own life. The language which follows the language of this poem is an archetypal instance of poetic language. Now I wish to open a file as my discourse unfolds on the matter of poetic language, the kind of language that characterizes poems by contrast to natural languages. Note, all poetic speakers speak poetic languages, and all poetic languages, the speech of each poetic speaker, have this in common: they are distinct and other than natural language, and are the language of a class, not of an individual. For the language of class or collectivity has a stronger hold on time of a different kind than the language of the individual. It is to the language of the collectivity and the relationship of the language of collectivity to time that poetic language solicits, and from it derives its capacity to live across time, to convey images across the lifetimes of individuals. Why? Because it is the speech not of an individual, not an idiolect, not the speech that characterizes the separated person, but the speech of a class or a collectivity which does not die when the individual dies, a speech which is the proper repository of the will to be known beyond the life of the separated person. The power for truth of the language the children speak when they play their singing game derives from the fact that it is not the language of children, but rather the language that the fair lady requires and contributes as a condition of relationship. The otherness of the language of the poem is a trace of the poet's relationship to the source of language to which he turns in the apostrophe by which he invokes the principle of poetry. Let is empowered only because it is addressed to the source. Let is empowered only because it is the expression of a relationship to an empowered other which can extend the will to structure beyond the ability of the desolated mortal who has survived the catastrophe which requires the rebuilding that the poem undertakes. Note also, poetic language at the very least differentiates itself from natural language. And I want you to put a marker on this simple observation. Poetic language at the very least differentiates itself from natural language in that it adds to the rules of grammar. They are the constructive principles of natural language. Poetic language adds to the rules of grammar the rules of the metrical line, which are the rules not natural by which nature is repaired.
This is the end of Side A. Please fast forward the cassette and turn it over to continue.